All right. Are we ready? We ready for story time? This is going to be a good one. All right. The Lord be with you. Let us pray. God, we pray for the world that you so love. And we pray especially today for our truth tellers and our historians. We thank you for their knowledge and their skill and the ways in which they so carefully steward our story. And we pray that they would grow in their work and others would be drawn to witness to the wisdom of our shared history in this place, using our narrative to change the narrative and to make your kingdom known here on earth. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. So, oh, wow. Okay, I just left my introduction for Chris on the printer. That's great. Dude, yep, this is Chris. All right, well, we're just going to kind of fly by the seat of my pants here. This is the fabulous Dr. Christopher Allen Graham. He goes by Chris. Yeah. Uh, he is a public historian, and he formerly was a curator at the American Civil War Museum right down in Trideger at Trideger Ironworks. He now is working as a curator at the State Museum of South Carolina in Columbia, South Carolina. So he's doing some commuting. Um, he specializes in 19th century American racial history. Is that fair? Okay. And we know him as the amazing author of Faith, Race, and the Lost Cause Confessions of a Southern Church, which was published in 2023 by University of Virginia Press, that tells the racial history of St. Paul's. This is one of the great, well, it's too late now. Thank you, though. Um, this is one of the true fruits that came from a long time, many people working together, but Chris really serving as the voice and the narrator to put together our story based on our History and Reconciliation Initiative. So it is my great pleasure and joy to welcome Chris to this podium to talk to us about Robert E. Lee.
Good morning. Um, but haven't really worked with this setup yet, so all right. Okay. So yeah, pray that I grow in the work. That goes for I still have a lot of growth to do. So one of the things I need to work on in my work is to not make these so long. But we have a lot to go through because this is my favorite talk that I'm giving. Just got to mention that none of this is possible without Ann Hayes' research. And I know she didn't like me putting her on the spot, so please, Ann Hayes. Um, However, all the interpretation is entirely my own. So if you don't like what you hear, it's not Ann's fault. So come to me about it. So this morning I want to talk about a story about Robert E. Lee. And you may have heard it before. That one time he knelt next to a black man at communion as an act of racial reconciliation. Or maybe you heard it is that time that Lee knelt in order to erase the presence of a black man and restore racial order after emancipation. Or maybe you heard it as the time he knelt next to a black man to resist the violence of the Jim Crow regime. Or that time he knelt next to a black man to integrate Southern universities and churches after the Brown versus Board decision. Or that time he knelt next to a black man to protest the removal of Confederate monuments. This place is as familiar with this story as any place in the world. What we've been calling the Lee Communion story. And so we're going to do this in three parts. We're going to talk about the story and how it changed. We're going to talk about some facts and then we're going to talk about the myth. And first, the story. We begin in 1905, clock that date, 1905, when Confederate veteran Thomas Brown of Charleston, West Virginia, told his story to a Richmond Times-Dispatch reporter. And I'm going to read, it's a little bit longer as a quote, but I'm going to read it anyways because this is the subject we're dealing with, so this we need to know. He says, 2 months after the evacuation of Richmond, business called me to Richmond for a few days, and on Sunday morning in June 1866, he said 66, or the paper printed 66, but they meant 65, I attended St. Paul's Church. Dr. Minigerode preached to a congregation fairly good. It was a, sounds like faint praise. It was a communion day. When the minister was ready to administer the Holy Communion, amongst those who first arose and advanced to the communion rail was a tall, well-dressed, uh, a tall, well-dressed Negro man, very black. He walked with an air of military authority. This was a great surprise and shock to the communicants and others present, who frequented that most noted of the Episcopal churches in Virginia. Its effect upon the communicants was startling, and for several moments they retained their seats in solemn silence and did not move, being deeply chagrined at this attempt of the federal authorities to effectively humiliate them during their most devoted church services. Dr. Minigrode looked embarrassed. General Robert E. Lee was present, and he, ignoring the action and very presence of the Negro, immediately arose, in his usual dignified and self-possessed manner, walked up the aisle of the church to the chancel rail, and reverently knelt down to partake of the communion, and not far from where the Negro was. This lofty conception of duty by General Lee under such provoking and irritating circumstances had a magic effect upon the other communicants, who immediately went forward to the communion table. I, being one of those numbers, did likewise. By this action of General Lee, the services were concluded, as if the Negro had not been present. It was a grand exhibition of superiority shown by a true Christian and great soldier under the most trying, offensive circumstances. Okay, so the story was quickly reprinted by, in the, I missed my slides already. These are the main points out of the thing. This story was reprinted in the Confederate Veteran magazine with minor edits. What is Brown describing here? It goes like this. The black man had approached the altar. The black man approaching the altar was an attempt by federal authorities to humiliate the church. Lee acted by ignoring the man, and he thus saved the congregation from, quote, provoking and irritating circumstances. It's clearly segregationist in its intentions in 1905. A fact that popular writer Myrtle Lockett Avery noted when she retold the Brown's version in her 1906 book, Dixie After the War. She described the black man as sinister, a challenge, not an expression of piety. After Lee's silent rebuke, she wrote, the people followed and the service proceeded as if no innovation had been attempted. And Tom Shoup, you need to check out this book. Where are you? You need to check out Myrtle Lockett Avery's book because her revelation about Lincoln in Richmond was the big kind of leading thing in its reception. Just kind of a moment in time, talking about what we were talking about earlier. Anyways, the story got picked up by various writers in years after, notably by historian Walter Linwood Fleming of Louisiana State University, who contextualized the moment in his 1919 History of Reconstruction by placing it in a passage about how, quote, the former good manners of the Negro were now replaced by impudence and distrust, and how agitators used black people to push in on white spaces during Reconstruction. And Fleming did a thing here that almost everyone else following him did. He reduced the story to its bare outlines. Quote, he said, quote, in a Richmond church, a Negro from the street pushed his way to the communion altar and knelt. There was a noticeable pause. Then General Robert E. Lee went forward and knelt beside the Negro, and the congregation followed his example. He has taken out Brown's commentary, leaving Lee's intent uninterpreted. Lee's, quote, example is left for the reader to imagine, but Fleming's interpretation is crystal clear from the way he framed the story. His version is in a paragraph devoted to freed people being what some would call uppity. But also the larger, and Fleming is still a well-respected academic historian for his time. And in fact, the big history lecture at LSU is called the Walter Linwood Fleming Lectures that produced some great scholarship in recent years. But also the larger context that often determines that interpretation is just as important. And that's one of my main points here. Larger context matters as we interpret historical events. All these writers, Brown, Avery, Fleming, have a context that give meaning to their reading of this event. These are white authors writing in the years after the formalization of racial segregation, which they agreed with, and they agreed with it because of the historical imagination created by themselves in which black people were undeserving of civil rights, if they had it, and if they have it, because if they had it, they would become impudent and disrupt white people's sense of order. So in their telling, Lee was offended on white people's behalf. We're also in a period in which the lost cause dominated the historical narrative. And I don't need to introduce anyone in this room to the lost cause, but one key element of it that I also suspect that you all are aware of already is the cult of Lee. And the cult of Lee maintained that Robert E. Lee, in his character, in his military leadership, was possibly the most perfect man ever, and certainly one of the greatest Americans ever to live. And that's not a joke. He was a man above politics, race, and existing only in a state of sublime nobility and honor. This mythic Lee was often then deployed as an example of aspirational behavior and also a way of distancing the nuts and bolts of the Confederacy from its historical legacy. Historian Benjamin Brawley read Walter Fleming's version of this story, and he retold it in 1921. Brawley had a different context that shaped his interpretation. A black historian, Brawley saw the joyous chaos of emancipation and noticed that the white South regarded it as an insolence, to which they responded with passion and prejudice. And I'm quoting Brawley here in this story. Violence, he meant, lost my tempo here. The violence, and he said that, quote, after 60 years, that, quote, 60 years after, we still suffer from the Ku Klux solution to the problem of racism. But Brawley took a revealing turn. When he evoked the story, his takeaway was that Lee had personally defused the situation, the tension, and compared to 60 years of Ku Kluxism, the diffusion of tension was preferable. It was a hope that Brawley had to align with. And Brawley took the story for granted and used it not as an investigation of a historical event, but as an imaginative take on what paths might have defined race relations but hadn't been taken. He didn't make the claim that Lee intended a new day of race relations or that Lee intended to promote racial equality. He intended to say that Lee met a racial problem without violence. And Carter Woodson did this too in 1938. Woodson's version contained the same dynamic as Brawley's, pitting the genteel racism of some against the violent racism of others and taking a side. Some of the words that Woodson used hinted at his context. Quote, how simple would have been the task of interracial cooperation if all men of both races had followed the example of this distinguished leader of the South. Of course, for context, the context for Brawley and Woodson was that Jim Crow society in southern was that of Jim Crow society in southern states. Black professionals often felt compelled to agree with the cultural assumptions of white folks. So they're in no position to challenge the cult of Lee, the law, or the lost cause, the way that some outside of the South did. Instead, they're going to employ it. The 1920s and 1930s saw the flourishing in southern urban areas of the interracial cooperation movement, and that's the phrase that Woodson used when referring to what might have happened here. In which the interracial cooperation movement, in which white people worked together with elite black people to address the problems of poverty and disadvantage in communities and advocate for solutions. Of course, with the white folks being in charge, they never faced that segregation itself might have something to do with the problems of inequality. But the interracial cooperation movement proved a fruitful venue for black leaders to work out problems with white leaders. And the key thing is these genteel white folks were not fire-breathing racists. In fact, they frequently condemn racial violence and the Klan, as two rectors here at St. Paul's did during this period from the pulpit. But I want to make this crystal clear, is that they are hardcore segregationists, and their genuine desire to promote black uplift was an attempt to prove that black uplift could work within segregation, that separate really could be equal. And this picture, this image that's up here is the executive committee of the Virginia Interracial blah, blah, blah. Commission for Interracial Cooperation. That was Richmond's version of the interracial cooperation movement. And this is 1939, and they're standing on the porch, on the portico of St. Paul's. So if you, those are our columns, those are our doors. It's over on this side of the steps. You can go in there and recreate the site for yourself just after stepping out of here. Okay, so it makes sense that Brawley and Woodson would see a glimmer of moderation in Robert E. Lee, the man, and use that example to cultivate the cooperation of the more moderate segregationists of their own day. They didn't really have an alternative. For the first half of the 20th century, the story remains somewhat under the radar, and you can tell so because in 1949, when historian Stanley Horn reproduced the Confederate veteran version in his Robert E. Lee Reader of primary sources related to Robert E. Lee, the national press seized on the Lee communion story as the only truly new take about Lee that Horn gathered up for his collection of otherwise well-known first-person accounts of the man. The Associated Press, in a notice about the book's publication, led its wire story that ran in countless newspapers across the nation with the teaser that Lee had resolved a racial situation in a church. The visibility that the AP coverage gave to the story introduced it to millions of Americans in a completely different context, and those in the new context used it accordingly. First is the context of the Cold War. This is 1949. The war against Nazi Germany had thrown a stark light on American race relations. And where many Americans had been indifferent to segregation before 1941, now they regarded it as a problem and a weakness in the Cold War standoff with the Soviet Union. And the national mood began to turn against racial inequality. Also, black Americans discarded the interracial cooperation movement and began in the 1940s to mount direct challenges to legal segregation rather than cooperating with elite white people to chew away at the edges. White Americans offered a spectrum of responses from massive resistance to acquiescence with the new laws of the land. In this evolution, black people quit paying fealty to the cult of Lee. So that's beginning to fail. The premier issue of this era after Brown versus Board in 1954 was the matter of integration, of whether and how to proceed with white folks and black folks sitting down together in churches, public spaces, schools, and government buildings. So the story of Robert E. Lee kneeling next to a black man, allegedly recently revealed by Stanley Horn, in 1945 and 49 and publicized by the AP is going to have tremendous resonance. And the story is then taken up by white liberals, particularly Southern white liberals, to advocate for a moderate approach to integration. And it always showed up in moments of racial tension. So journalists like Washington Post columnist Benjamin Muse started it off by using it in 1954 to chide opponents of church integration, and his editors picked up on this message when they wrote, quote, "We can't help wondering what General Lee would say today about the new breed of crypto Confederates who talk windily of nullification while simultaneously heaping praise on Robert E. Lee." And since I'm spent a couple hours last week dealing with Strom Thurmond in 1949, that's incredibly relevant. It's a South Carolina thing there. It gained nationwide attention in this period when I.F. Stone published it in his famous newsletter, and he's not a Southern liberal, Northern New York liberal, in his famous newsletter in 1956, after the riot that denied Arthurine Lucy entrance into the University of Alabama. He told the usual tale and concluded with the South's quote, "greatest hero never showed his greatness more clearly than when he knelt in Christian fraternity beside the human symbol of his own defeat. We can see that the South is not wrong in worshiping Robert E. Lee's memory. The pity is only that it does not follow his example." North Carolina liberal politician Frank Porter Graham, no relation, unfortunately, used it several years later when Governor Ross Barnett provoked another anti-integration riot, this time at the University of Mississippi campus in October 1962. And they're all using a still potent cult of Lee. He's still potent to white people, a cult of Lee to badger Southern conservatives that had mobilized Confederate memory to resist integration. These liberals, more than others, implied a motivation by Lee completely at odds with Brown's version. Whereas Brawley had only hinted at it, these liberals said this is what happened. That this kneeling was an interracial act of racial integration and tolerance. And no one did this better or more frequently than liberal editor of the Atlanta Constitution, Ralph McGill. In 1963, just after the assassination of President Kennedy, an act that McGill connected to the violence of anti-integration movements, he forcefully condemned the, quote, cult of Southernness, unquote, that sustained racial segregation and used the story to advocate for a genteel, tolerant acceptance of integration, the way he imagined that Lee had done. In a way, they're doing the same thing that Brawley and Woodson had done a generation earlier, preferring order and tolerance when the alternative was riotous violence, and invoking a historical story to imagine their own desires into existence. McGill's calls came simultaneous to the promotion of the story for the same purposes by another Graham from North Carolina, and still, sadly, no relation. At least to me, there might be someone in this room. Where'd Miss Montgomery go? Who might be related? Billy Graham. Graham was a cautious, moderate integrationist. In 1956, in Life magazine, and in 1960, in the Reader's Digest, and just figured out yesterday that he also published this in Ebony magazine and U.S. News and World Report. Graham cited this story to condemn biblical justifications for segregation and to warn that American segregation hindered international evangelism and to encourage white Southerners to follow what he described as Lee's example. But while Graham dismissed segregation, he always defaulted to individualism in his solution. What mattered was not a change in systems, but a change of heart amongst individual people to overcome the problem of racism. In this way, Graham served as a bridge to the modern embrace of the story by conservatives and its suggestion that Lee's actions signaled a change of heart that solved a racial conundrum without resorting to systematic analysis of the social problem of racism. And think about how we kind of talk about racism today. Is it a matter of the heart or is it a matter of systems? Is it, you know, that coalesced in the 1990s and well into the post-civil rights world, where two contexts matter. First is that civil rights had ensured a political voice for Black Americans in the public life of this country. What this means, among other things, is that the cult of Lee has been utterly dismantled as a myth that could ostensibly unite and inspire Americans in the civic space. Many of you in this room probably already know this, but we've got Henry Marsh, the first Black mayor of Richmond, is on the screen meeting with council members. The second context is that a historiographical revolution has occurred as scholars have firmly placed race and slavery at the heart of the American Civil War era, including Reconstruction and the Confederate experiment. We can no longer seal off the good character of honorable men from the political and racial implications of the cause they fought for. And third, Lee is no longer above politics and race, but now a participant in racial politics with partisan opinions. Taken together, the cult of Lee had lost its power among Black people and white liberals. So in this new era, center rights commenters have taken up the liberal civil rights interpretation of Lee Communion's story, and more specifically Billy Graham's version of it, in which he did it to promote integration, but did it to promote integration through a change in his own heart rather than a change in systems. But they're doing it in a very defensive fashion. And it goes like this. Lee's racial tolerance exhibited at the communion rail absolves the Confederate States from its racial intentions, and Lee's personal embrace of racial tolerance is the proper method of approaching the problem of racism in society today. This interpretation shows up most when Confederate iconography in public has come under assault. For instance, when Black Richmonders objected to a portrait of Robert E. Lee on the flood wall in 1999, several commenters, including the Washington Post editorial board, suggested that the Lee depicted might not be of him in his military uniform, but instead of him kneeling next to a Black man. This happened again in 2020. When anonymous advertisers in the Richmond Times-Dispatch defended the Lee Monument and what they perceived as Lee's reputation by asserting, among other things, that, quote, he knelt to take communion with a Black man when no one else would. A letter writer subsequently suggested that the equestrian statue be replaced with one of Lee kneeling next to a Black man. The highest profile perpetrator of this version of the story recently has been Jay Winnick, the author of April 1865, upon which a popular History Channel documentary was based, and maybe some of y'all remember that documentary being filmed here at the chancel rail. This version of Robert E. Lee as a reformed and open-minded racial egalitarian matches the post-civil rights effort by neo-Confederate partisans to identify a multiracial Confederacy, including Stonewall Jackson's Sunday School, Jefferson Davis's allegedly adopted Black son, Jim Limber, and Black Confederate soldiers. So what can we get from following the evolution of this story that has been used so often as an inspirational guide by invoking the morals of a noble man for a good cause? We get that the morals of a historical story matter more than the accuracy of events it claims to portray. And to discern morals, you must understand the context of the storyteller. And finally, you must expect that those contexts change over time and give new meaning and new morals to a historical story. Now, you noted we started off by saying that this first appeared in 1905, which raises the question of, did it even happen? Which is what most discussion that revolves around this story these days kind of leads to. So, let's talk about some facts here. Let's step back to 1865 and review the evidence. Lee was in Richmond from April 12th to June 28th. This gives him 2, possibly 3 opportunities to take communion because Episcopal churches then performed communion once a month. But what is Lee doing in Richmond? Getting noticed. He's getting noticed and talked about. Northern newspapers breathlessly reported on his condition. He was getting cheered in the streets. He was reportedly receiving rations from the U.S. Quartermaster Department. His indictment for treason was pending. One bombshell from the New York Herald reported on Lee's opinions regarding secession, the war, and the status of freed people, to which we'll get back to in a moment. So he's highly visible, and every little thing is getting reported on. Was his church attendance noticed? Of course it was. A New York Express reporter saw him at St. Paul's one Sunday and remarked that he arrived late for service, and that his white beard was especially white, from his experience, and said something about what he was wearing, but otherwise blended into the congregation. And more importantly, he prayed along with the liturgy in that part where it calls for prayers for the president when other congregants appeared hesitant to do so. That's it. Not once does anyone watching him in Richmond newspapers, Northern newspapers, St. Paul's Vestry records, any available private manuscripts, anything, does this incident gets mentioned. With everything else that got reported on, what he's wearing, what he's eating, how he's praying, if Lee had performed this highly dramatic act, people would have remarked on it, and no one did. I really don't know what motivated Brown 40 years after the fact, what he saw, what he remembered. But there are some telling items from his own context. First, this is Brown on the left. He mentioned the story to a Times-Dispatch reporter who had wondered about the lack in 1904 of new stories about Lee. Brown was a known storyteller, and he'd embellished stories before. Was known to have embellished stories before. His claim to fame is that his self-proclaimed claim to fame is that he had been a man who sold Lee's horse, Traveler, to the general. Brown spun that simple business transaction into a heartfelt friendship with the general in later tellings. So when the Times-Dispatch reporter asked, Brown's memory and imagination went to town, but he's not a reliable narrator. But I'm not going to say that he just made this up out of whole cloth. His second context is because I don't know what he was thinking. But his second context is this story is remarkably similar to one then popular about the Duke of Wellington, who was reported to have invited a homeless veteran to kneel next to him over the objections of observers with the statement that, quote, "We are all equal at the foot of the cross." In fact, Billy Graham's early anti-segregation pronouncements relied on that phrase and that story before he picked up the Lee Communion version to add to his rhetoric. And also, in recent years, the two stories often get conflated, such as when Jerry Falwell told it in 1980 and attributed the Duke's words about all equal at the foot of the cross to Lee at St. Paul's. Oh, there's Wellington. And the third is the story conforms to what veterans of the Army of Northern Virginia admired in their commanding officer, his unflappable nature in moments of crisis, and his ability to use just his presence to calm panicking officers around him. He did the same to calm a panicking congregation around him. Veterans recognized it. Brown's is more of a character study than evidence of a historical event, in my opinion. For these reasons, I don't believe this happened at all, although I'll always be willing to change my opinion with new evidence. But until then, I'm in good company. Douglas Southall Freeman didn't buy it. When the 1949 notices of Stanley Horn's book came up, reporters turned to Freeman to verify it. And he replied that, quote, "There is absolutely no foundation in fact for it. All my researches show that this is a story that grew up after General Lee's death. There is no contemporary record of it whatsoever." And historian Virginius Dabney quipped that the story should be classed as one of the many legends. I still laugh at that. In circulation. Um, it's interesting because historians have been kind of a mixed bag recently. The most judicious uh, do not deny that it happened or otherwise don't mention it. Elizabeth Brown Pryor, if you're interested in reading a fantastic history of Lee, check out this book. Um, she's um, among them. Uh, some adopt a stance of skepticism and admit that it probably didn't happen, but can't help but mention it, thus keeping it in the imagination as a possibility. Our friend David Cox did that in his book on the religious life of Robert E. Lee. Some repeat it uncritically, such as Emory Thomas in his book, Robert E. Lee, a biography. And Emory Thomas is a fantastic modern academic historian, but boy, he slipped on this one because he embellished the scene a little bit, I think. And many people have picked it up also from Charles Flood's biography of Lee, which is probably more popular than Emory Thomas's. Okay, so in my opinion, it didn't happen. But as myth, does it reveal a truth? To which I'd first like have to ask, which truth? Brown's truth? Brawley's truth? McGill's truth? Graham's truth? Graham's truth? Graham's truth? Winnick's truth? That of the cult of Lee? Does it tell us something about Lee and race and reconciliation in the post-war South? Does the story as a myth reveal a truth? Does it explain something in the primordial American character or the direction of American history since the end of slavery? Does it make, as this 1949 headline put it, a good American story, myth or not? Okay, the myth. Let's work through that. To work through the myth, to see if it reveals something truthful, we have to look at another set of contexts from 1865, and that is Robert E. Lee and his own context. We begin with the context of race in the Episcopal Church. In 1859, local lay Episcopalians and clergy met at St. Paul's to resolve a problem. This is 59. Slavery is still intact. They really wanted black people to become members of their churches, but black people were not becoming members. They reasoned correctly that because their customs determined that black people sit in the galleries and come to the communion rail last, that black people wouldn't feel welcomed in the church. They then stated that obviously we can't have integrated communion, so we'll just set up an entire church for black people who are Episcopal curious, and that became St. Philip's here in Richmond. This is an interesting insight here into pro-slavery Christianity, which is deeper into Lee's context, which white people defined as an organic and friendly relationship in which white folks directed black Christianity and black folks took that direction. In a larger sense, they understood slavery as a Christian mission, and in providential time, God would command the end of slavery. That is the context in which Lee uttered his oft-quoted phrase, quote, "The final abolition of human slavery is onward, and we give it the aid of our prayers and all justifiable means in our power." And he's saying that very specifically in opposition to abolitionist recommendations for the end of slavery. He's saying God's going to decide. Let God decide, not man, not me, not you, not the abolitionists. God will decide. And pro-slavery Christians kind of let it lie there, and they're never going to let God decide. And it was also part of the secular paternalism of slavery, in which white people imagined that enslaved black people were content in bondage and respected the lines of segregation that white people established. White Christians acknowledged the end of slavery in 1865, and while they were dismayed that it was over, they regarded it as a providential judgment meted out by God through the instrument of the U.S. Army. But did white Episcopalians also give up the sense that they had a paternalistic responsibility to black souls, or that maintaining unequal race relations through the segregated etiquette within church sanctuaries? No, they did not. And remember, in 1865, the status of black people at this time in terms of what their relationship to the U.S. body politic, so to speak, was up in the air in terms of citizenship and rights. The Civil Rights Act, the 14th and 15th Amendments were still years in the future. And let's look at the Bishop of the Diocese of Virginia in 1866, John Johns. At the annual council that year, he gave a speech declaring that black people's spiritual character still remained the responsibility of Southern white people, and he condemned what he regarded as black people's, quote, extravagant notions of liberty, by which he meant black people's expectations of racial, social, and political equality. And he might have been describing this apocryphal black man who took charge and marched to the front of communion when he said that and considered that an extravagant notion of liberty. And what does this context mean for Lee? The denomination he belonged to and the churches he worshiped in very consistently enforced a theology of paternalistic control and a practice of interpersonal racial etiquette in church spaces that did not allow for equality in seating or kneeling. And despite the one big exception, Robert E. Lee was generally not a rebel. His personal code of duty meant that he obeyed the institutions he believed in. He's not going to step out of line on a matter like this. But that doesn't mean that he didn't have opinions, or at least aspired to be a Southern, or didn't aspire eventually to be a Southern thought leader in these matters. That's the second context, his views on race and reunion. And I turn to historian Elizabeth Brown Pryor again on this to describe him as having developed a rather calculating and evolving political take on sectional reunion after 1865. Yes, Lee did advocate early and often for former Confederates to return home, work, and be loyal to the United States. In the summer of 1865, that was a useful take because plenty of Confederate soldiers were willing and ready to continue the fight as guerrillas, and they looked to Lee for guidance. The fact that Lee told his men to stay home and be loyal seems to have had a positive effect in quelling potential violence that summer, to which Lee should be given all due credit. It's also useful to Lee because in April and May of 1865, he was expecting an indictment for treason, and he didn't want to do anything to make the inevitable worse. He continued to tell, the indictment never actually came down, but it was a reality at the time this all happened. He continued to tell his soldiers to work hard and be loyal, but behind the scenes, as Reconstruction evolved, his opinion of reunion became more and more bitter and conditional. After the advent of congressional Reconstruction in the 14th and 15th Amendments, he began to write private letters expressing a seething contempt for the United States as newly constituted. He didn't care for Northern society. He didn't care for the legislative branch taking the lead in Reconstruction, and he really had thoughts about the attempts through them to enfranchise black people and move black people towards social and civic equality. His opinion on the matter of reunion and peace became more and more conditional, like this. We can be loyal. We can agree to this reunion if you stop doing the things like insisting on political and racial equality. He died before he could develop this as a public critique, but he was perfectly in line with white politicians who already said the same thing out loud. And that brings us to the third context, Lee and race after emancipation. And I want to make this clear here and kind of referring back to his pre-war quote about the providential future of slavery. Some people often attribute to Lee an anti-slavery sentiment based on that quote. In these statements, he expressed a very conventional pro-slavery critique of slavery, that the worst thing about it was the burden it placed on white people. He expressed a conventional pro-slavery Christianity, and that slavery will end when God decides for it to end, and that we should be happy when that happens. He recognized, like many pro-slavery Christians, that slavery had problems that could be reformed because like the interracial cooperationists in the 1920s and 1930s, they wanted to see slavery work in the idealized frame that they placed it in. So he's extremely conventional as a pro-slavery Southerner in his racial thinking going into Reconstruction, where he continues to be extremely conventional. His take on freed people in the 1865 Herald interview, the one that he gave while he was in Richmond at the time that this alleged story happened, he says, quote, "The Negroes must be disposed of." And that doesn't sound as bad as it sounds. What he's saying is what he meant is that a new legal relationship that governed white and black people together and governed black people in their relationship to government needs to be worked out. Previously, that had been slavery, but what's it going to be after slavery? So he says, the Negroes must be disposed of. We need to figure out how we're going to relate to them now. And if their disposition can be marked out, the matter of freeing them is at once settled. But unless some human course is adopted based on wisdom and Christian principles, you do a gross wrong and injustice to the whole Negro race in setting them free. He hasn't given up the idea that white people have to have paternalistic oversight and legal inequality with black people. This is the exact same moment in which the communion story allegedly took place. Man, when this goes out, I got to reset the whole thing. Oh, it's back? Oh, awesome. Bring my power cord next time. Um, in short, Southern whites are obligated to continue. Excuse me. This was the exact same moment in which the communion allegedly took place, and Lee was staking out a firm belief in the segregation and unequal race relations. In short, Southern whites were obligated to continue a paternalistic and unequal relationship with black people to guide them, and any effort of the federal government or the Republican Party to insist on civil or social equality was beyond the pale and would be met with resistance. And it was, as you know. We also see this in Lee's 1868 White Sulphur Springs letter, in which he and his co-signatories declared that, quote, "We are, for obvious reasons, opposed to any system of laws which will place the political power of the country in the hands of the Negro race." And to these folks, any participation was essentially placing the government of this country in the hands. But this opposition springs from no feelings of enmity, but from a deep-seated conviction that at present the Negroes have neither the intelligence nor the qualifications which are necessary to make them safe depositories of political power. They would inevitably become the victims of demagogues who, for selfish purposes, would mislead them to the serious injury of the public. Everyone who felt this way also insisted that black assertions of equality, like maybe striding to the front of a white congregation, were an offense to white people and a symbol of investing them with governmental power that they, in these people's opinions, shouldn't have. Offense to white people, insisted that social spaces, including commuting rails, remain segregated. So this is a conservative man, Lee, not inclined to go out of his way to make a radical Republican statement about racial equality, even before the radical Republicans had made it. This is a man, like many other Southerners, who were content regarding political reunion and even encouraged it. But these people did not equate political reunion with racial equality, which was, in 1865, not even an agenda item yet for congressional reconstruction. When Congress began insisting on citizenship for black people, many ex-Confederates dug in their heels against federal power, despite their claims of loyalty. In short, in 1865, you can advocate political reunion while at the same time resist racial equality. Lee did pray for the president in 1865, after all. Maybe that's what Brown witnessed. Lee did not kneel next to a black man at the communion rail as a sign of racial equality. In his context, that's not even imaginable. So what does any of this mean? Well, I'd like to hear what you think any of it means, but just my take is that it means that this story doesn't even make a good myth because it doesn't reveal something true about Lee or anyone like him. And it certainly didn't reveal anything about the way that ex-Confederates approached the issue of race relations in 1865 or any other time in their lives. We can't look to them for inspiration on this, even if it's just too good a story. The only truth it reveals at this point is that of whoever is conveying the myth, the story. And that goes for most well-worn historical stories as well. So, thank you. I don't know what time it is. What time is it? 12:35. Oh, thank you, Michelle. Um, I think if you want to ask some questions, if you have to go, go ahead. If you want to ask some questions, we're here. All right.